So this one's going to be a bit different. Rather than any specific commander or even a group of them that I'm doing a deck tech for, this is the commanders that I am never going to make a video on. So these can be for a number of different reasons. And the first reason in this category is cards that are not legal in Commander. So the silver border and acorn stamped unset cards, or any equivalent to that. So while you could make a deck based on one of these commanders, and you could, rule 0, ask your playgroup, hey, I want to play, Baron von Count, is that fine with you guys? Most players are never going to make a deck with any of these commanders, either as the commander itself or in the 99. Most players are never going to see this. So it just, for the most part, really doesn't make sense to do a video on it. And it is somewhat of a shame. For example, I really, really like the Grand Calcutron. I think this would make a very interesting commander to build around and to play games with. But again, just the vast majority of players are never going to build with any of these cards. The second category is cards that just straight up suck. The power level is not there. There's just no reason to build any of these commanders unless you're, I don't know, trying to test yourself somehow, like you're doing an IRL Dark Souls run, but with magic cards. So there's lots of cards that fall into this category. The most extreme example are Vanilla Legends. Nobody wants to see a deck tech on Tobias Andrian, a 5 mana 4/4 that doesn't have any abilities. But it's not just vanilla creatures. There's plenty of cards that just do not make the cut. And I understand EDH is a casual format. If you're not playing CEDH, you can technically build whatever you want, but most players want their commanders to be powerful. They want their cards to be powerful, and it just doesn't make sense to build a commander that just doesn't do anything or is so weak that you just have plenty of better options of things to choose from. And directly related to that last point, the next is going to be commanders that are just blatantly worse than other commanders. So a good example here would be like Marwyn the Nurturer versus Selvala Heart of the Wilds. These are both 3 mana green creatures that tap to add an amount of mana equal to their power, but Selvala has more toughness, which means it doesn't die to things like Bowmasters, for example. It generates mana for any amount of power, so you can use pump spells or just other big creatures to generate tons of mana really fast, whereas Marwyn, you have to play elves and you have to play a lot of them. Selvala also draws cards, Marwyn doesn't. So although technically Selvala isn't 100% strictly better than Marwyn in every single circumstance, she's basically in 99% of the situations that you're going to encounter better than Marwyn. So there's no reason to build a Marwyn deck when you could just build Selvala instead. Another example of this would be something like Edgar Markov versus Mavrin Fane Dusk Apostle. Mavrin Fane has a really crappy ability where you make a 1/1 vampire if you attack, no matter how many creatures you're attacking with. Edgar Markov makes a vampire whenever you cast a vampire from anywhere, even if it's in the command zone. It's also 3 different colors, so you get access to better cards, especially black. Mavrin Fane's only a single white mana here. So Edgar Markov is just by far the better vampire tribal commander. There's no reason to build a deck around Mavrin Fane when you have access to Edgar Markov. Again, unless you just really love Mavrin Fane for some reason. The next category is generic good stuff commanders. So the best exemplar of this is Atraxa Grand Unifier. Usually 4 or 5 color commanders that don't really do anything too interesting. They're just some generic card advantage engine. You could really build any sort of deck around them. You're just going to stuff all the best cards in these colors into the deck, and the card doesn't specifically lead you down any sort of interesting route or design space to go into. You just put this in your deck. Whenever you cast Atraxa, you draw a bunch of cards. That's it. If you've done one deck tech on a commander like this, you've basically done the deck tech on every one of them. There's nothing really interesting to say about them. Again, they all sort of do the same generic card advantage stuff, so there's no reason to make a video on things like these. The next category is going to be every single partner combination. So while there might be some merit in doing like, Tymna Kraum or, Tymna Thrasios or whatever, there's no real reason to do every single partner combination that you could possibly do. Once you've done, Tymna Kraum, Tymna Thrasios, you've basically covered all the Tymna decks. You don't really need to go over every single combination of all of these cards. Again, maybe a card that's interesting like Tymna you could cover, but you don't need to cover every single one of these in every single combination that you could have. The next combination is every variant of a commander. So take a commander like Kenrith the Returned King. So while he definitely has certain cards that you want to play, maybe cards like Training Grounds that reduces activated abilities, or infinite mana combos so that you can use the blue ability to win the game immediately, there isn't necessarily any specific strategy that Kenrith can be a part of, and this is evidenced by the many different versions of Kenrith decks that you'll see. So there are Kenrith mid-range decks, there are Kenrith stacks decks, there are Kenrith combo decks that win with Hermit Druid. So there's lots of different ways that you can build Kenrith, but do you really need to cover Kenrith multiple times? Like, do I need to make a video of Kenrith and describe every single possible strategy that he could go under? I don't think so. I think you can basically get the gist. You can say, here's Kenrith, here's a sample deck of what Kenrith does and some of the strategies and synergies that you have with his various activated abilities. And if you want to build a more, let's say I do, the mid-range Kenrith deck, right? I can just say, if you want to build the more stacks version or the more combo version, you can build those versions instead. I don't need to make multiple videos to cover every single possible variant of every commander. So next are the commanders that just don't make any sense within the context of the format. So these are cards that were either made before Commander was a format, or they're just designed in such a way that their abilities don't work within the rules of Commander, or they just don't make any sense within the context of the format. So the obvious example of these are like the Myojins, which are creatures that have an ability that you can activate by removing an indestructible counter from them, but you only get the indestructible counter if you cast the spell from your hand. So obviously, if these cards are your commanders, you're casting them from the command zone, not your hand. Another example is like Phage the Untouchable. If it's, when it enters the battlefield, if you didn't cast it from your hand, you lose the game. Obviously, this doesn't make any sense to have as your commander, because if you ever cast her, you just lose. So the cards that it's not necessarily that they're too weak, but their abilities just don't make any sense within the context of the format. And then lastly are the cards that it's not necessarily that they're too weak, but that their abilities just don't lend themselves to any sort of interesting design. So for example, Minichi the Fevered Dream, right? This is a good example. It's a red creature and it's got an ability that says switch each creature's power and toughness until end of turn. And on the surface, that might be like, wow, that looks really interesting. Like you could take a creature that has 0 power but high toughness, then you activate Minichi, you switch the power and toughness around, and you can beat down your opponent. But if you actually look into the amount of cards that are in mono red or colorless that have low toughness, low power, but really high toughness, and what are you really doing with that? Like, you're not really gonna build a deck that's necessarily too interesting around this. Like, I could make a video on this guy, but ultimately this commander just would ultimately not be very powerful. He wouldn't be very interesting to build around. And Minichi isn't obviously the only commander that is in this. I just thought it was a good example of that type of commander. So yeah, those are the different sorts of things that I'm just never gonna make videos on. I don't think they would be interesting in particular for anyone to watch. Stick to things that are either powerful or have interesting designs that lead you into playing cards that are cards that you wouldn't normally play in another deck. So I think an excellent example of the opposite is stuff like the Gitrog monster. Now, even putting aside that the Gitrog monster is powerful enough to be as a commander, it just leads you down a very interesting and unique route where you're playing things that you would never play in any other deck. So a card like the Gitrog monster or, Yuriko or other things of that sort, those are the kinds of cards that you want to build decks around and that make for interesting videos, not the other things that I already mentioned. But anyway, yep, that's going to be the end for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.